I want to say hello to the panelists as well, which have gone through the hard work of preparing the panel with me. So we chose a little bit special format. They each had one slide to contribute that they will use as a starting point for 3 sections that we're going to have in the session. I will come back to the intros for my fellow panelists in a minute. But first I have a question for you. What is the current market share of electrified vehicles in the world? Any knowledge, any estimations? Yeah. So it's around 2%. Depends on where you're going. Who was right? Who was right? Round of applause for those who were right. Well, coming back to a more serious topic, these 2% seems to be enough for a company like Daimler to take a very radical step in publishing openly on September 19th to stop developing internal combustion engines to focus on electric cars. And that's based on a market share of 2% amongst the disruptors, right? Now, what does this have to do with our industry? Open access has achieved somewhere over 20% of publishing output. It has achieved somewhere over 10% probably by now in share of revenue. But there are still people that think that this is just going to go away and this is far too small to dislodge any of our fundamentals in our industry. And again, for Daimler, 2% were actually sufficient to make a very radical move. For Daimler, this strategic move heavily impacts the organization, and it also heavily impacts the technology that Daimler is going to use down the road. Completely new technology. And in STM publishing, we're facing the exact same innovation challenges. We need to strategize for innovation, we need to change our organizations, and we have to make good use of new technologies. So that's what this panel is going to be about. I'm now very pleased to introduce the panelists, starting with Stephen Inchcoombe. Stephen has been the Chief Publishing Officer for Springer Nature since 2016. Originally a physicist and certified accountant, he started out at Interactive Data Corporation, IDC, a financial data provider where he ultimately became responsible for strategy, M&A, and the EMEA region. He then moved on to board positions with the Financial Times Group, including UK publisher of the Financial Times and managing director of FT.com. From 2007 to 2013, he led the Nature Publishing Group, NPG, and in 2013 became CEO of Macmillan Science and Scholarly Division. Following the creation of Springer Nature in May 2015, he was appointed Managing Director of its Nature Research Group and most recently promoted to his current position. To his right, I would like to introduce Jayne Marks, which I'm sure doesn't need introduction really, given that she's a former member of the STM board, but still a few words here. Jayne is the Vice President of Global Publishing for Wolters Kluwer Health, where she's managing and growing a portfolio of products for all health professionals, from student to practicing clinician. Former positions include Publishing Director for Macmillan Press and later the Nature Publishing Group, CEO of Global Operations for MPS Technologies, and 2 vice president roles for Sage. Her original background is in chemistry. Next, I'm introducing Sam Herbert. Sam is a co-founder of 67 Bricks, a technology company that is working on the evolution of content and data capabilities at publishers. At 67 Bricks, he oversees consultancy and software development projects to ensure they achieve the client's business objectives. In this role, Sam has taken a lead in exploring how technologies like AI, machine learning, and natural language processing can deliver value in the information industry. Sam's former positions include senior project management and leadership roles in the media industry and Cancer Research UK. His original background is in physics and microelectronics. And last but not least, we have Pierre Montagano, the far end of the table. Pierre leads sales and business development for CodeOcean, a cloud-based computational reproducibility platform. Prior to CodeOcean, Pierre was the director of sales at Squid Solutions, a usage analytics company that enables publishers to become more data-driven. Even before that, he has held both product marketing and sales leadership positions with some of the world's leading scientific and education publishing companies like Pearson, McGraw-Hill, and Cambridge University Press. And finally, his original background is in social science and history. So thanks again for being here, for having gone through the ordeal of preparing this with me. We will start now. We have broken down the session into 3 parts: strategy, organization, and technology, and 3 of the panelists will introduce with 1 slide the respective sections, and we're starting with strategy now, and I'm very pleased to hand over to Stephen for his initial remarks.
Daniel, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Of course, strategy, the S word, has many guises under which it presents itself. And strategic frameworks are, there are as many as there are business books to go to. I wanted to speak about one that I'd had some recent direct experience with. At Springer Nature, we used something called OGSM, stands for Objectives, Goals, Strategies and Measures. And other major organizations in other industries, Philips, Unilever, as a couple of examples, have deployed it well. The benefit of a framework is really one of allowing comparability and consistency between the different strategic approaches that you can take. OGSM works by setting initially the primary objectives of the organization, and then translating those into measurable goals so that you can assess how you're doing against that objective. And from those goals, you set out a series of actions, of strategies to enable you to achieve those goals. Innovation and its different guises is clearly one of the means via which those strategies can be applied. Other examples might be operational excellence or premium brands and so on. Innovation is only one tool in the box. But it's one that has a variety of approaches depending upon the degree of ambition, depending upon the position the organisation finds itself in, the changes that are taking place in its market, the customer needs that it's trying to address, and indeed how technology, whether as an enabler or a challenger, is changing that context. I tried to organise, at least in Springer Nature, we try to organise our innovations around 4 themes, and they're actually at the bottom of this chart, so I'm just going to, rather than keep sitting in the way so you can't read it, just list out what they are. The first group are what we call adaptive. They're essentially about evolving the current offering within the current model. And I would say the vast majority of us as publishers put the vast majority of our effort in that. It's more straightforward, it's established customers with an established model, understanding what their developing needs are is something that I would say is part of the DNA of most organisations, and trying to better meet those needs is part of the mission and what brings us to work and inspires our colleagues to be able to make an impact every day. The second group is disruptive. And there we're talking about evolving the current capabilities, but also reinventing the model. And I think the most obvious example, and Daniel's already referred to it in his opening remarks, is open access. Realistically, if you go back 20 years, and perhaps it's a the slowest revolution in history. As publishers, we did not embrace it. And 20 years down the road, we're coming to terms with it, but I would not yet categorize it as we've all become evangelical disruptors of our own business. And yet the needs, and I think particularly Annie's opening keynote this morning, if we are up against the fake news that's open and being reproduced at head-spinning rates, locking up the evidence-based approach is, from a societal point of view and for the future of science and research, not a very constructive way of empowering it to have its maximum impact. A third area would be radical. That's essentially reinventing the offering with new capabilities under the current model. And there perhaps some of the things that we've already referred to earlier today with the combination of human capabilities with artificial intelligence and machine learning perhaps allows us to more radically rethink the knowledge equation and allow us to do things at scale and with efficiency levels that we could only once have dreamt of. And the last would be architectural innovation. And this is really entirely new offerings for new models. And I think sometimes, at least in our organization, people say, just a minute, that sounds like diversification, we've got to be careful, we've got a core business that really needs lots of attention, let's not get distracted by that type of diversification. But actually, as an industry, if we are not going to reinvent ourselves, others will do it for us. So I think determining how we take adaptive, disruptive, radical and architectural forms of innovation and apply those for the different objectives that they can incorporate within a strategic framework that allows the whole organization to embrace, utilize and ultimately deliver is, at least for us, at Springer Nature, our hypothesis on how innovation can be incorporated and ultimately delivered across the organisation. That was my attempt to frame this discussion. I will now hand back to Daniel.
Yes, I think you did a great job. Many thanks for laying out the 4 types of innovation. I think we will come back to that topic when we talk about organizing for the different types of innovation. But my first question goes to Pierre. Pierre, you have worked in large and small companies alike. I think I visited Code Ocean's offices in New York once, and it's really, I hope you will understand what I'm saying. This startup groove is still there, like with the logo on the wall and people sitting mostly in one room. Where do you see the similarities and differences in the role of strategy between a large company and a small company?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for those opening remarks. And I think you are right that in large companies really are playing and focused in this sort of adaptive or disruptive models of change. And, and I think the large differences between, big company and a small company are the obvious ones, in that large companies aren't able to move or shift very quickly. I used to work for a publisher that was centuries old, so to get anything done in a year was a miracle. The equivalent of we're talking about weeks. And I think the problem with working in the adaptive and disruptive sort of modes of innovation is, if you're adaptive, if you're evolving the current offering under the current model, what ends up happening, and a great analogy for this is Blackboard. You end up creating more and more features onto your products to the point where then the product becomes overly complex to use, right? And so simple is hard, right? I used to have a boss that always said, making something simple and intuitive is extremely difficult. And then in terms of the disruptive model, sort of evolving the current offering to reinvent the model, I think a really good example there publishing companies in a lot of ways are trying to transform themselves into workflow companies or analytics companies. And inherently, the beauty about working with a small company, for the most part, the startups that I've worked for, is we're born cloud native, right? And larger companies have the differences in very large publishing organizations. You have these legacy systems which can really slow down innovation. And once again, going back to the Blackboard example, the real reason Blackboard couldn't compete with something like Canvas is they were born cloud native, and it was very difficult for them to sort of scale up their offering in a way that was seamless and intuitive. But the thing I want to really focus on, as the big difference is, in a lot of ways, big publishing companies, and this is obviously my opinion coming from my experience, are really focused on B2B, right? They're focused on making money. And they see the way they make money is through their business relationships. So when they're thinking about their product, a lot of times they're thinking about features for the actual buyer. And startups, at least in startup culture, a lot of times, once again, it's my opinion, it may not be true, but my feeling is in the startup culture, we're singularly focused on the user. The user, we're all about the user. And a lot of times startups are created out of the frustration an actual user has with the current ecosystem or how things are done. So by actually focusing on the end user, then what we realize is that, and I'm a technologist, but I'm going to say technology is actually the easy part, right? And then when it's what we focus on then is really kind of changing user behavior. And that's really difficult, right? So you really have to prove to a user that your product either simplifies what they do or adds a significant amount of value above and beyond what they're currently doing. So I think I'll reserve the rest of my remarks for a little bit later, but I'll just leave it there in terms of the differences between a large company and a small one.
Thank you. Sam, you're in a different position from a publishing company because you're a service provider and solution provider to companies. How do you perceive strategizing and strategy in your customers? Or put more simply, what do you do when you have a first conversation with a customer and realize they either have no strategy or have a strategy that is not prepared for the amount of change and innovation that you with 67 bricks are going to bring into the company?
Yes, good question. So one of the things we get asked regularly is, why now? Why do we need to do it now? Can't we wait? And that's an interesting question for traditional organizations, because you have these large platforms that are generating significant cash. But what I say in those situations is you need to think about yourself at the start of a race. And until you engage in that journey of innovating with your customers, getting closer to your customers, understanding the end consumers, what they're doing, how they're doing it, and gathering the data around that, and going down that journey, you are still on the starting line. Whilst you have these other publishers, some of your competitors have already started the race. And whereas the other startups and disruptors in the industry are already lapping you. So the question of why do we need to do it now is because you are getting further and further behind in your ability to move to the point where you need to be in 5 to 10 years. And I would question anyone who says that their organization will be fairly similar to what it is now in 5 to 10 years' time. And if you wait for another 2 years, that time you have to change is reduced, and it is a journey you go on. You cannot suddenly switch to being a different type of organization. You have to, as Annie was saying, you have to try lots of things, and you have to get faster at trying lots of things, and you have to evolve what you do with your customers, and you have to get close. You show them something, and they say, that's interesting, but actually the thing I really wanted was you to do this for me. Oh, right, okay. And you start doing that, and then you do that, and then you get another group of users say, oh, that's really powerful, and actually if you do it this way, and that journey takes time. So starting now or starting a few years ago is where I think people should be.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any digital competence coming into boards or at the C-level?
In certain instances, yes. I'm smiling because of certain people in this audience are bringing in with people with technology capabilities from outside of publishing, and I think that's a key thing that's happening, and I think it's a really big. It's driving significant change at the board level, and in all honesty, you said about technology being the simple part. In reality, in a lot of cases, it really is, because what is being done out there by other organizations is fairly standard. Building systems that are componentized and can communicate via APIs and can change quite quickly, and you can make changes to one component without touching anything else, and you could launch a new version of your platform every 2 weeks. This is standard stuff out there in publishing. Whoa, okay, we've got an 18-month roadmap, and if you want to make a small tweak, we'll put it onto the end of the roadmap, and in 2 years' time, you'll probably get that minor feature.
Yeah. I'm sure we can come back to this in the technology part. Pierre mentioned that in startups, especially in startups, there's a lot of focus on the customer.
User, not customer. Because the customer ends up a lot of times being the person that is not your user.
Okay, so the user, and you mentioned bringing in competencies from outside the publishing industry, and that leads to the question, in the strategy processes, how has bringing in stakeholders and external stakeholders changed now that the pace of change is growing? Maybe Jayne, you Wolters Kluwer's perspective.
I think what you have to do is to figure out how you're going to have that conversation with your customers and train your staff to be able to interact with customers, users, in a different way. Because I think we have a sort of tradition of saying, what do you think of this? Rather than going out with that inquiring mind of saying, what are you doing? What are you trying to do? What's getting in your way? And then really listening for those clues to give you an idea about how you can improve your products. And I think that comes into some of the organizational thinking about what kinds of capabilities do you need in an organization, and training. You need to train the next generation of your staff to be able to think differently.
Stephen, you introduced this model of 4 forms of innovation. How do you find the right balance between the different forms in your large company that is, to some extent, still depending on very classical business, as most publishers are?
Our approach is back to the objective and the goals first. In our case, we have some areas where we're trying to accelerate our ability to adapt, and I'd say that affects most of our business proportionately still today. The move to open science and open research, you might put as the headline of disruptive, but hopefully not the only area, and that's become much more mainstream in our organisation, which is helpful because more people from more functions get involved and build confidence that disruptive isn't worse, it's different. It can have benefits, but it can also have challenges. Some of those are about managing risk in a different way, some of them about managing returns in a different way, some of them about improving cycle time so that you can get clear signals earlier in the process. I'd say still for us, radical is compartmentalised in very specific areas that we want to either challenge ourselves or have an ambition to move beyond our normal way of working. And I think in the whole scope of research publishing, the different disciplines that we work with allow you to, if you choose to, take a different approach that, you know, the computer scientists maybe have a very different appetite to some longer term scientific processes where committees get very involved and where therefore the ability to take a radical approach is going to be very difficult to get a committee to feel the confidence and buy in. And for us, architectural is, we see publishing with moving from an intellectual property to a servicing business. What other services the research community or communities need to help them succeed is where we would put architectural, and therefore those are different businesses, and we'd sort of have a business unit within the wider company that is able to operate not just differently to the rest of the business, but also have a different approach to partnering with other organisations, because we don't believe we're likely at all to be able to provide a complete service by ourselves, and better to do that with others, especially younger, more dynamic organisations that we can try and bring some of our strengths to and harness some of their strengths together.
I think this builds an excellent bridge to the second part of this, the session, which will be about organizing for innovation. And Jayne has a few introductory remarks for us.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you for giving us the wonderful task of summarizing an entire topic in one slide. It was good discipline. So could you bring that slide up? There we go, my one slide. So I was trying to think about how we've organized ourselves over time. And for a very, very long time, the publishing industry was very, very static. We were patting ourselves on the back with the fact that we had gone digital. But really all we had done is taken something from here and put it here. In essence, it was exactly the same. I can remember conversations about, well, how do we recreate the front matter in a digital format? Who cares? But we cared. We cared. We'd done this. We'd had front matter. We'd had back matter. It had to go digital. So our organization was very similar as we went through that journey. Yes, we added a technology team or a technology vendor, but our skills, our internal skills, were focused on those traditional skills of editorial, curation, production, sales, and marketing. And it didn't change for a long time. And I think over the last, as we were talking about, over the last 4 or 5 years, the bigger publishing companies have started to take different directions and say, we've heard many of them say, we are no longer a publishing company. So what does that mean? What does it mean to move into digital product development? Because that's what we're talking about, is really following that customer journey and saying, what do customers really want from our content, from our books, from our journals? Do they want chapters, articles, etc.? How do they want this to be served up to them? So you need a different set of capabilities, everything from UX, UI, product management, and product owners, scrum masters, all these kinds of different roles that in a truly agile product development process you have to make it work. But on the other hand, you still need that basic editorial content creation, curation, etc. But of course, our businesses have not grown. So how do you change your structure to bring in these new competencies, to bring in these new skills, to find these people out there who can really enrich your organization and help you to change without doubling, tripling the size of your organization, which for most of us is just not an option. So that's really thinking about the individual organization development, deciding for yourselves what are the key capabilities that are going to help take you down that particular strategic route that Stephen talked about earlier. Are you going to go to be the disruptor or to adapt? How are you going to do that? What market are you going to focus on? That then takes you into what skill sets you need, and really diagnosing your organization and working at how you can start to pivot individual roles and bring those in. But then that starts to ask a lot of questions about, so who is driving the vision going forward? Is it the same people? So is it the people who are out there talking to the customers and coming back and saying, no, they don't want a journal, they want this? So how do you then have a decision-making process and a structure that actually helps you to go in that direction? And then you have to think about the processes. And that's the bottom right-hand box there. We talk a lot about lean product development, about agile technology, agile processes. But actually putting those in place is much, much harder in a traditional structure than it is perhaps for a startup. The idea of releasing something every 2 weeks is anathema probably and I was talking to somebody the other day and saying, you launching something in less than a year takes us 7. I mean, 7 years? Anyway, so how do you bring that into an organization, and how do you really make that part of the DNA? So it's partly structure, it's partly skills, it's partly training, and it's partly rewarding the right behaviors. So are we rewarding the experimentation, the risk-taking? And that's hard for a traditional publishing company to do. So do you then take this innovation and put it in a box over here, or do you encourage it throughout the whole organization? One of the things that Wolters Kluwer does is sets a strategic ambition. I think it's probably worth saying. It's sort of, this is where we want to go. And then every year we have an innovation tournament. Anybody in the company can take those strategic themes and say, I have an idea. They put together, a team of people will get together, they put together this idea, it goes into this tournament, and 4 or 5 ideas come out at the end of this very large organization as a sort of, if you like, a beacon of where we could go and how we can really energize the entire organization to think differently, to think innovatively. So I think it's that mix of being able to, at times you really do need to set something aside to make it that sort of radical innovation group. But then on the other hand, if you're not changing the core of your DNA to think differently, to act differently, then you're not going to change. The two, I think, have to be a mix. So then when you've thought about the people, the skills, the organizational structure, what kind of process do you want to go through, then it comes down to the sort of hard nuts and bolts of, how are you going to actually set up your organization? Are you going to be product focused? Are you going to be functional? Are you going to be customer? Are you going to have teams around individual customer groups or user groups? Because they're usually, in our world, the users are not necessarily the customers, the buyers. How are you going to think about process change? How are you going to think about decision making? Is that going to be small self-directed teams, or is it going to be top-down hierarchy? And I think many publishing companies have been hierarchical and somewhat functional for years. So changing that and thinking differently about moving to potentially self-directed teams is something that's it's just not in the way that we have worked. So I think bringing in those people from outside who have done this differently, again, can help to be change agents, to help you to think differently about how you are innovating, how you're rewarding innovation, and how you perhaps are stifling innovation without even realizing you're doing it. So those are my sort of thoughts, building on Annie's theme about how do we do experimental and how do we become experimental and risk takers in an industry that has been traditionally very static and not changed for a very long time.
Thank you. I would like to start by addressing the cultural dimension of organizing for innovation in your company, because we have heard several statements on the panel now that if you want to do radical innovation, then you have to create a separate team, and probably it's somewhere outskirts of town with soccer table, and so that's the romantic impression or image that you have of a startup or of an innovation team. But as you said, if you're organizing an innovation tournament, there are some people that will show up and others that will feel left out. So I think there is a big challenge in when you're organizing for radical innovation the way you describe, to make sure that this radical innovation can flow back into the organization. So how are you doing this at Springer Nature, Stephen?
Thank you. I don't think we're doing it well enough, so I'm not sure I'm the person to try.
You can also speak about how it should be.
Right. The transition we find quite challenging because the motivations, the risks, the ambition is much more different to what the rest of the organisation is used to. We've had an innovation, I don't think we called it a tournament, but it was a degree of competition from people across the organisation, and we struggled with it. It was ultimately set aside for a more systematic approach and a more targeted one. So to answer your question, I think we do ring-fence things until we think they're ready for, if you like, the mainstream. Give them some protection, give them different targets with different tolerances, but also different expectations about pace and about outcome. Our UX people move between two groups. There's a main group that supports the core platform, but they can be seconded into that group as an example, as a little bit of a recognition that they're taking a genuine user-centric view and are more ambitious for how different things could be than most of their peers. And the same can apply with our developers. We have perhaps a more frequent example of innovation in our case is our regular hack days, where we invite people, researchers from the community that we know are active, to work with our own developers for a day, normally around one or two identified needs that are currently unmet, as opposed to, can you consider X more? Here's a problem. How would you go about solving it? So those things bring in people from our core development teams, mix them with our customers, get them focused around different activities. So that's more a case of energizing the core. So they don't feel left out on those who had the privilege to be given some time and space separately, and we don't end up with a sort of two-tier system. So I guess it's essentially a mix of mechanisms, some of which I'd say, through trial and error we found we weren't very good at, and others of which we're much more enthusiastic about because we can see how they work.
Jayne, you mentioned that different types of innovation are taking place in Wolters Kluwer as well, and you mentioned this very important point of attracting new talent, different talent. Do the skills and capabilities and personality traits differ between types of innovation? So if you're hiring somebody into radical innovation, will that be a different person than somebody just polishing the existing?
I think so. I think you're looking for people who are prepared to perhaps take some risks, and as opposed to someone who perhaps follows the rules, if you like. You're looking for people who can see things from a different perspective, and So I think you need a mix. You need a mix of people who can have the radical ideas, the sort of, the blue sky thinking, what if we did this? But then you need that nice mix of sort of practical people to say, well, how would we do that? Let's try and build something. Let's try and actually create a sort of a small product that we can take out and say, if we built this, if we gave you this, would it be helpful? And I think that, following on from what you say, I think this idea of hackathons or something like that, which is common in tech companies. We don't call them hackathons because if you're in tax and legal, that's not a good idea. So we call them code games or something like that. But it's basically bringing a group of technical people in. We just held our first one a couple of weeks ago. And it was a group of tech people. Again, they took a particular topic or challenge, worked with a product person, spent 24 hours, 48 hours working on a particular topic, and presented working code at the end. And it was fun. It was really interesting to see how that different perspective, thinking differently, sort of thinking outside of the box, can actually bring in some new ideas and some change. And then the challenge is, how do you harness that? How do you take it to market?
Maybe a last question before we head on to the technology part. It's a question to Pierre. Again, you having seen organizations of different sizes, what can kill innovation in a company? What do you think can kill innovation in Springer Nature, and what could possibly kill innovation in Code Ocean?
So I think, maybe, I don't want to, kill is a strong word, but I think what can really hamper innovation in a lot of big companies is, in a sense, almost the impression to people who are very innovative and who want to seek change, that there isn't a role there for them in those companies. Right? So I think that there's also an image problem that, a lot of times big publishers talk about innovation, they want to be innovative, but reaching out to that community of people that are really in the space of innovation, there's almost a disconnect between those two communities. It makes it really difficult for them to go and work for very, very large companies. On the other end, when you go to the startup culture, and I've gone to a lot of these stand-ups or sit-ins, I'll sit around in bean bags and do some meditation, and then we get to talking about the problem at hand. And there is a lot of times there's a prevailing thought that publishing is easy, like, oh, we're going to come in and we're going to completely disrupt publishing, and we're going to change everything. And I think that that's a really naive, there's a lot of naivete in terms of young startups looking into the publishing ecosystem and not understanding right out of the gate the complexities around publishing. And I think it really hampers them in working with established partners and really going to market, right? So I think that there's, on both sides, they're really, I think large companies need to do a better job of presenting themselves as being innovative and really promoting innovation within their companies in meaningful ways in order to attract talent. And I think a lot of the startup culture really has to come to accept that publishing is not easy. There's a lot of complexity to it, and publishers and all of the players in the ecosystem, bring a lot of value, and that needs to be respected.
Thanks. So we talked about agile software development and the use of technology a lot already, so I think it's time now to go to the third section of our session with the introductory remarks by Sam.
Could you?
Yeah.
Oops. So, our world is changing, driven by the pace of technology innovation. I've picked three particular areas of technology innovation that are driving this change. So the first is data. 15 years ago, General Electric were building jet engines, and they were trying to understand why certain jet engines were failing before other jet engines. And this was costing them tens of millions of dollars a year because they had to bring out of service all the jet engines at the earliest possible time. And they started adding measuring devices to these jet engines. And they started gathering data, and they started analyzing that data. And it turns out that those engines that were failing sooner were those that were flying through parts of the atmosphere that had more sand in it. useful, interesting. It saved them tens of millions of dollars. Since then, they've been adding more and more measurement devices. Move forward to now, and you have a single jet engine generates about 4 terabytes of data an hour. That is more data than Twitter generates in a year. GE now have a data services department which is bigger than their jet engine business. Where we move forward from here is there is research being done into how can we use the biological structures of DNA to store data. If we can do that, and if we can achieve that, then you'll be able to store the total world's data in a teaspoon of DNA. Next is processors. So, approximately 50 years ago, we managed to land astronauts on the moon with a computer that was 100 times less powerful than the Nintendo Game Boy. Step forward to now, and we have a supercomputer that has more processing power than the human brain and can store 10 times as much data. Step forward just 3 or 4 years, and you will have a desktop computer that costs $1,000 that will have more processing power than the human brain. Step forward to 2050, and you'll have a single desktop computer that costs $1,000 that will have more processing power than the entire human race. If that doesn't worry you, then... And the third area, I think, is algorithms. And he touched on this. Algorithms are driving all aspects of our world right now. The one that really interests me is how it's changing coding and how it's changing how we build software. I liken it to the change from the cottage industry to factories. Previously, software developers had to write code as if-then-else statements, and it was all hand-coded, and the developers were defining the rules. With algorithms, with machine learning, you feed it data, you feed it objectives, and it tells you what the rules are. And it does it far more accurately and far more efficiently than humans can do when they're writing code. For example, we get tasked with doing things like here, 100,000 documents. Can you go and categorize this? Can you automatically categorize this into groups? And previously, that would have been 3 or 4 weeks of work at least. You build a taxonomy, you write a set of rules, you speak to subject matter experts, you show them some results, you tweak the taxonomy, you tweak the rules, and after 4 weeks, you have a good pass at it. Nowadays, with machine learning algorithms, you can do that in 2 or 3 hours. Google now says that it can detect metastatic cancer 99% of the time. If we compare that to human experts, some research said that human experts, with time constraints, miss small metastases on individual slides as much as 62% of the time. Hugely different, hugely a massive change. So we have these technology drivers for change, and I think we also have some specific drivers for change in SDM. And Annie talked about quite a lot of these, so I'll be very brief. But content overload, new types of competitors, providing the types of content that your users and your customers typically want and the answers that they want. A lack of focus on the end user of the content. Traditionally, as it's already been mentioned, we focus on the gatekeeper, on the librarian. And we've learned a lot about them, but we know very little about the end users, why they're using your content, what problems are they solving with it, how are they using it, how does it fit in with their workflow? And that's a real issue. And then we have distribution disruptors. We have the likes of Google Scholar and Sci-Hub changing the way that people find scientific content. And as a scientific publisher, you should be absolutely terrified when you realize that the majority of the usage on your site is people coming in, getting one piece of content and leaving again. In a world where your online presence is who you are and your platform is who you are, that should absolutely terrify you. We're talking really about disruption here. So it's really useful to understand, it's really important to understand how disruption happens in the modern age. And we can take a look at examples, Amazon, Google, and Uber. What did they actually do? How did it actually come about? So Amazon, their first disruption was about getting books to you, delivering books to you. And what's interesting there is they didn't change the outcome. The end user still ended up with a book in their hands. But what they did was they fundamentally changed the user experience of achieving that outcome. And that changed the whole industry. and developed a multi-billion-dollar company. Google, their first disruption, simply providing you with information about companies. Again, the outcome is not any different. You still have the telephone number of the company you wanted to contact or a bit more information about them, but it was the experience of achieving that outcome that was radically changed. Uber, you still get from A to B, but it's the experience of achieving that outcome that has fundamentally changed. And we need to recognize that. And that's how disruption happens. And we need to get better at delivering better user experiences using technology. So my final comment is that I propose we need to innovate at the intersection of business insight, user need, and technology capability. We need, as organizations, to get our best thinking, our best insights, our best data in all of those three areas. It can't be led by either one of them. In all of those three areas, and it's where those areas overlap that real innovation can happen.
Yeah, you mentioned the three parts of innovation: business objectives, technology capabilities, and user needs. And technology is only one of them, actually. So, which leads to the question: should we see technology as a driver or just a facilitator of innovation? Because more often than not, technologies are hyped, especially at the beginning. Let's take blockchain as an example. So maybe just the question to Pierre again. How do you see this? Yeah. Is Code Ocean a technology company, or is it a publishing innovation company?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think, we're a company singularly focused on users, and I think, I've said this before, I always say, I'm a technologist, but actually technology is really the easy part, right? It's identifying, so when I talk about Code Ocean is a company that's singularly focused on facilitating a better experience for the user, right? And as if technology is easy, what really is the difficult part is changing user behavior, right? And that is always, in my opinion, a product of execution and not the technology. And I think it's RCA invented the transistor, right? And they couldn't do anything with it because when they listened to the radio, it was staticky, it was tinny. Compared to vacuum tube radios that they did produce, they said, there's no way we can sell this technology. And they gave it away to Sony, right? And we know the rest of the story there. And now Sony's under threat from another disruptive model. So, it's technology, you can always develop the solution. It's how you execute the solution that is really the challenge. And in order to do that, you really need to be focused on the user. And offer something that provides true value, right, or saves time, right? And I think if you look at a lot of the innovative companies, the real disruptors, in the past, 2-3 decades, they've always either provided significant amounts of value or saved time.
Yeah. Well, I think we should increase our focus on the user as well by taking questions from the floor now for the last few minutes. Darrell is there with the mic.
We have a question here.
Yes, hi. My name is Florian and I work for Clarivate. I found very interesting that you've mentioned that you're trying to innovate by creating these brainstorm sessions internally, the hackathons or whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, having been in some of those, I've realized that sometimes there's a tendency to reinvent what already exists in the market. And what I've noticed is that sometimes these hackathons are internal events. I wonder what the panel believes about those young startups out there that have proven themselves, both to the end user, but also to business customers. And how would you see interacting with them? Would you see, hackathon sessions where instead of inviting internal people, you only invite external vendors to pitch their ideas? How do you invite them in, so to speak? I guess that's my question.
Who would like to go for this? Sam?
I have a view that there's two types of innovation, and it's a less granular version of Stephen's, but it's iterative and transformative, and you need to think differently about how you do those different things. Iterative needs people who understand the current users and the current models, and transformative needs people who are going to break rules and they're going to change things. And I think you need to organise, and I think we've talked about this, but you need to organise separately around that. And so when it's transformative, I think it absolutely makes sense to bring in lots of insight from outside, to have that transformative team reporting directly to the most senior person in the organisation you possibly can, give them as much free rein as you can. I would suggest don't even give them objectives, and allow them free rein. And that's where we've seen the best R&D happen. And I'll be very honest, publishers are pretty terrible at transformative innovation. Sorry. But where it has worked really well is there's been individuals within organisations who put themselves forward and continue to say, I want to do this innovation, I want to do... And then finally someone says, okay, we've got this budget set aside, it was going to be for something else, but that didn't happen, so just do this thing. They go away, they're allowed to do it, because it's under the radar, they go away and we do this fantastic work together. And there's actually, it got taken back, this one particular example I'm thinking of, it got taken back to this large group of people, it got presented, and someone stood up, at the end of it, it was like someone stood up and started clapping. Suddenly realised they were British and obviously sat down again. But there was huge excitement, and as soon as that happened, there was at least 5 or 6 people around the room who were like, okay, so how do we formalise this? How do we put a structure around this to make sure that my bit of the business gets some benefit from this? And the next round of innovation turned into 2 small features on the platform. Whereas previously, it was something that was going to disrupt the business and the whole industry. So I completely agree with you. And how you do that is both, I think, external, but also internal. And you just look out for those people who are probably kind of frustrated at the moment, kind of are looking for that opportunity, and then bringing in people externally who've done this as well.
Do we have one last question? Yes, right here in the back.
Do I have to stand up as well? Yeah. Rob Johnson of Research Consulting. So a lot of what I do is look at kind of research and innovation systems as a whole. I was interested, so we heard about obviously innovation in a corporate context in startups. Do you have any experience of learning from academic researchers or innovations developed in the public sector? One of the things that prompts me to think about that, I think, is David Crotty here? Yeah, hi David. So David wrote a really good post about some of this recently. I think there was an interesting dialogue in the comments about, things like Cielo and some of the Latin American developments, and are they as innovative as startups and so on. So just be interested to see any examples where you've seen innovation happen outside of the kind of commercial world, or is there scope for more learning from elsewhere?
I think there may be some people from digital science here, but they're a sister company to us, and a number of their businesses were academics who were trying to solve problems, who ultimately, in succeeding in solving the problems, wanted to scale them and turn them into commercial businesses. I don't say digital science is the only place where that's happened. I think there's others, but I think there's about 10 or 12 examples where, if you look at the digital science website, where that story is told by the founders about how they came out of academia, what they were trying to achieve, and I'm sure they could also put you in touch with others, because there is a community of other similar people with other similar approaches, and perhaps Pierre, actually, you probably are a member of that community more than I am, so perhaps you'd like to comment.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, like, in our space, there are a lot of, like, the Jupiter project, I think, is really, is quite well known coming out of academia and like the open source communities. I think what's interesting is, is the whole sustainability around these initiatives coming out of academia. And I think that's a real challenge for us who are working in this space where we're preserving, these artifacts that really need to be, discoverable and preserved for in perpetuity, so to speak. And so I do think that there's a nice marriage between that open source community and commercial entities, where a lot of times they're actually taking these ideas and creating these sustainability models around them. So I think that there's been some, like even us, we use the Jupyter UI on CodeOcean, because that makes sense for us. So this whole idea about taking from the open source community, but also giving back to the open source community is key.
We need to wrap it up here. There's one thing I jotted down very early in the session from one of the very first statements, which is simple is hard. And I think that pretty much sums it up. We have a lot of change to go through. There is a tremendous need for innovation, and it will be hard. And we still have to make it simple, because the users will be the ultimate judges of what we do. Thank you very much to the panel. Again, thanks to the organizers for the opportunity. Thanks to you for listening and participating. Back over to Darrell.